Boa tarde. Hello, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces here today. I want to welcome you all to the Wilson Center to this significant event, Bridging History, Forging Future, celebrating 200 years of Brazil-US relations. I'm Bruna Santos. I'm director of the Brazil Institute here at the Wilson Center. And first, let me say that we all here at the Brazil Institute at the Wilson Center, we extend our heartfelt solidarity to the people of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil, who are currently facing a historic climate disaster marked by severe floods and heavy rainfalls, a tragedy that has resulted so far in numerous deaths, displaced thousands of people, and affected over 2 million people. We commend the tireless efforts of local authorities, emergency responders, and the community volunteers, and we always stand united here in support and recovery. Today we gather here to celebrate 200 years of Brazil-US relations, and I want to thank our friends and partners from the International Institute on Race, Equality, and Human Rights for their support with this program. Thank you so much. This is a great partnership. And well, I often say that Brazil and the US are countries looking each other in the mirror, especially when it comes to challenges related to democratic governance. But this is not new. Brazil and the US have for a long time been societies in the mirror with sharing challenges, sharing a rich diversity, sharing a very vibrant culture. Both countries are vibrant, multi-ethnic democracies with a very rich cultural heritage. If we look at our music tradition, we see that. We see Brazil samba and bossa nova and the American jazz. They all embody this shared legacy somehow. They are all polyrhythmic. They all have a polyrhythm that beats our hearts and souls and that demonstrate these cultural connections that unite us. And this polyrhythm is actually a characteristic of the African musicality. It's a characteristic of many rhythms being superimposed. That's what happened with that thing that makes us all beat. And it has existed for hundreds of years, has influenced different rhythms around the Americas, like rumba in Cuba. And that beautiful 4/4, 3/4, 4/6, 6/4 actually time signatures in the rhythm is what makes those layers of complexity that somehow also express the layers of complexity of our societies, the Brazil and the US societies. And today, as we celebrate 200 years of diplomatic relations, it's important to say that this relationship goes beyond our governments. It's deeply rooted in our people, in our societies. And both Brazil and the US today face contemporary challenges that are extremely important for the 21st century regarding to governance, related to polarization, to inequality, climate change. And today we will discuss the current efforts being made to achieve racial equality in both countries. But more importantly, today is also a moment for us to envision the future of what we want for the next 200 years. I'm optimistic about it, I have to say, especially when I look and I see that the progress we have made through policies and initiatives that have created a more equal society in Brazil. For instance, Brazil has successfully reduced extreme poverty with Bolsa Família, which has contributed to a decline of 10% in the Gini index in Brazil. That's fantastic. It happened between 2001 and 2015. Now, addressing racial equality and building the next 200 years of bilateral relations require us to do this kind of debates that's open, that's honest, that's plural. And I want us all to use this opportunity here today to reflect on the present and forge the path forward for us, honoring this legacy of polyrhythm. So to help us here today to do that, I invite key ambassadors, people who have played and still play significant roles in the bilateral relationship. And one is former US Ambassador to Brazil, Tom Shannon, who is also our dear co-chair to the Brazil Institute here, and senior international policy advisor and co-chair to the global law and public policy practice at Arnold & Porter. and the Brazilian ambassador to the United States, Maria Luisa Viotti, who before assuming her duties here in Washington and has an illustrious career, including serving as Chief of Staff to the Secretary General to the United Nations and ambassador to Brazil in Germany. Please join me in welcoming them to this event. Thank you. Ambassador, please.
Thank you very much, Bruna. What a pleasure to be here today with all of you to celebrate 200 years of diplomatic relations and many more years of profound engagement between the United States and Brazil and between our two societies. It's a great honor for me to sit here with Ambassador Maria Luisa Viotti, who has done such incredible work as Brazil's ambassador to the United States during a politically complicated, challenging, but also important moment in the history of both of our countries. So, Madam Ambassador, thank you for the tremendous work you're doing. And it's a great pleasure to be joined here also by two former U.S. ambassadors to Brazil, Donna Reineck and Tony Harrington, who did such incredible work during their 10 years as ambassador, and also Ricardo Zuniga, who served twice in Brazil, but more importantly, as the great brain of the State Department's Latin American policy, really helped this administration, the Biden administration, shape an approach and a policy towards Brazil that highlighted our common democratic trajectory in the world. I'm very excited about the panel today. When I was Assistant Secretary of State working for then Secretary of State Condi Rice, the United States and Brazil signed the Joint Action Plan to eliminate racism and ethnic discrimination, otherwise known as JAPER. And the U.S. and Brazil began a conversation about a common history rooted in slavery and racism, but which has evolved into fundamentally creating the societies that we are today. And the way in which both countries approached this challenge, the way in which they addressed the importance not just of political liberty, but of economic empowerment and social mobility, is a story that is evolving over time, that still has a tremendous amount of work to do. But the enthusiasm that I encountered, both in Brazil and the United States, to begin to look and understand ourselves in this light and to try to find a way to show that democracy can deliver not just democratic government, but also create a democratic society in which equality is a founding social value and of profound importance, is something that for me shows the dynamic nature of the United States and Brazil, of our two societies, and indicates that if we're going to be successful as we look deeper into the 21st century, we need to have the courage to understand that we should listen to our own people. And in this regard, I believe that as hard as diplomats work, as hard as embassies work, and as important as it is to find ways to understand each other and to build national cooperation, the ability to connect societies and understand cultures is ultimately what is going to be a defining feature of the 21st century. We live in a century defined by change and transformation, in which social and economic developments have outpaced the ability of political institutions to manage them and to explain them to people and respond to them, which is part of the reason for the turbulence we face today, both in Brazil and in the United States, and the polarization we face today, both in Brazil and the United States. But as I think about this in larger global terms, I'm struck that there are two societies, Brazil and the United States, or it would be hard to find two societies, Brazil and the United States, better capable of dealing with this kind of change. Because of our democracies, because of the fluidity of our societies, because of the way in which information flows, because of the way in which dialogue can be generated, and because of the way in which our political leaders can work to find and create basic understandings and cooperation. I don't think this is hopeful. I think it's a realistic understanding of our two great nations. And I think we find ourselves today in a moment in which if we have the courage to look ourselves in the mirror, if we have the courage to understand what we're seeing in our political systems, and if we have the courage to reach out and build the kind of dialogue that our societies deserve, not only will we prosper individually as countries, but we will prosper together as partners in a larger, more complicated world. It's very striking for me that we are at a moment in which Brazil and the United States are mimicking each other. What happens in Brazil happens in the United States. What happens in the United States happens in Brazil. And this is a remarkable synergy that I think needs to be captured and directed in an important fashion. And it has, over the years, fallen to Itamaraty in Brazil and to the State Department here in Washington to manage this great relationship, occasionally connecting our leaders in order to define agendas and define pathways forward. But increasingly, I believe that the most important work that our diplomats will be able to do is, as I mentioned earlier, to connect our societies and to promote deeper understanding of our cultures. And in this regard, as we think about the 200 years of American and Brazilian diplomatic relations, it is really a prologue, a prelude to a different kind of relationship, a relationship between great democracies, between great economies, with the capability of feeding the world and of preserving peace and promoting understanding. And in this regard, Bruna, I just want to thank you for the work you've been doing here at the Brazil Institute. I want to thank our panelists for what they're going to present to us today. And I would like to give the floor to Ambassador Viotti. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Tom Shannon, for your words of wisdom. I've taken good notes because I think that you have framed the way, the challenges that we're facing now and the path forward in a very a wonderful way. So thank you very much for that. Thank you, Bruna. It's always a pleasure to return to the Wilson Center and to see so many friendly faces. I also want to recognize Ambassador Anthony Harrington, Ambassador Dana Reinach, and Ricardo Zuniga, great friends of Brazil and great interlocutors here for us. And I see also so many friendly faces in this audience. So it's really a pleasure to join you today as we mark this very important milestone, 200 years of a relationship that has been very, very important for us, I mean, for our countries, and not only a story of two countries, but also of a partnership that has endured and evolved alongside the very history of the Western Hemisphere. And it was very important to us that only less than 2 years after Brazil emerged as an independent nation, the United States was one of the first countries to welcome Brazil onto the world stage. And this early act of friendship really set the tone for a relationship that would endure and prosper over the years. And as Brazil transitioned to a republic, it drew inspiration from the American model for its first Republican Constitution. And this goes to show and underscore the shared values of democracy, rule of law, and freedom of expression that have long underpinned our relationship. Throughout the 19th century, our bonds deepened, trade flourished, and exchanges, cultural exchanges also blossomed. And at the dawn of the 20th century, the political foresight of Barão do Rio Branco, our patron, the patron of our diplomacy, led him to recognize the importance of stronger ties with Washington, and consequently, the U.S. emerged as Brazil's main trading partner and also a significant source of investments into Brazil. The 20th century brought the world closer, but also presented new challenges. The world war saw us stand together. In Brazil, the only South American nation to fight alongside the Allies, sent troops to Europe in World War II, a testament to the strength of our bonds. And allow me a personal note, because I'm very proud of the fact that my father-in-law, then freshly out of law college and very moved, motivated by the cause of freedom, was among the first volunteered early on, and was among the 25,000 troops or more that went to Italy to fight alongside the US and the Allies. So the post-war era brought close cooperation on regional security and also economic development. And Embrapa, I always mention Embrapa because I think it epitomizes this very positive cooperation, because its origins in the 50s are closely connected with the US and with a partnership between Purdue University and the University of Viçosa in my home state, Minas Gerais. And this brought about the creation of Embrapa, which has since become one of the finest agricultural research institutions, maybe in the world, and provided also the technological foundation for this transformation in Brazilian agriculture that turned Brazil into one of the largest, most efficient, and also most sustainable food producers in the world. And as we navigate the 21st century's complexities, as you mentioned, wars, geopolitical tensions, climate change, poverty, food insecurity, the Brazil-US relation remains very resilient and dynamic. The US continues to be our most important partner in services, trade in services, and the second in goods, and a very important source of investments, the main source of investments in Brazil. And additionally, what I found very interesting when I arrived here, and I didn't know this fact, there is increasing number of Brazilian companies that are investing in the US, generating wealth and jobs in this country. JBS, Gerdau, Coteminas, many others. And this number is growing, and we already have $43 billion invested here. When I first saw this figure, I thought maybe there is a comma missing, but no, it's correct. And Brazil is a country that is increasingly considered as uniquely positioned to help address some of the century's most pressing challenges: producing food, generating clean energy, supplying critical minerals, and fighting climate change. And this is why I think, well, the same for the US goes for the US. So this is why I think there is so much potential in our cooperation and so much more room to work on expanding our trade, our investments, and cooperation in general. President Lula's visit to Washington in February last year and subsequent meetings with President Biden have highlighted programmatic convergences, particularly in the promotion of growth with social inclusion and environmental sustainability. And the drive towards a low-carbon economy in both our countries has opened up new avenues of collaboration. So right now we are discussing the possibility of a new partnership for the energy transition between Brazil and the US, very much based on indications that both our countries have the potential to become the leading producers and exporters of new fuels, for instance, clean hydrogen, in a decade or so. And the private sector is, of course, fully on board. Sustainability featured very prominently on the agenda of the missions that we have, the business missions on both sides, as well as in the discussions of the CEO forum that took place in Brasilia last December. And the drive towards more resilient supply chains in a context of a changing global environment also opens opportunities for greater complementarity between our economies, especially in areas such as semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, critical minerals, and renewable energy. Of course, our shared commitment to democracy and human rights has further strengthened our bonds, and recent challenges that we have both faced the US in 2021 and Brazil in 23 have deepened our understanding of each other and also our cooperation on human rights issues. The Partnership for Workers' Rights, for instance, launched by Presidents Lula and Biden last September, demonstrates our shared commitment to fighting exploitation, promoting decent work, combating the increasing precariousness of working conditions, and facing the challenges posed to the labor force in the digital era. And the Brazil-US Working Group on Global Human Rights, and also the reactivation of the JPER, the Joint Action Plan to Eliminate Racial and Ethnic Discrimination and Promote Equality, also demonstrate our dedication to promoting equal opportunities and social inclusion. And as you mentioned, our societies share a past marked by the impact of slavery and can benefit from joint work and exchange of experiences in overcoming these challenges. And the meeting that we had, the JPER meeting last year, provided the ideal framework to identify specific areas and forms of cooperation with the participation, which is very important, of marginalized ethnic and racial communities, as well as other representatives of civil society. In Brazil, we are, as you know, fully committed to advancing the fight against racism and the promotion of racial equality, both at home and abroad. The establishment of two ministries, the Ministry of Racial Equality and the first Ministry of Indigenous Peoples, is very much a reflection of this commitment. And in March last year, the Brazilian government launched a first package with 7 measures to advance racial equality in Brazil, among which a program focused on regularizing Quilombola lands and promoting the rights of Quilombola populations. And last November, a second package was announced with 13 actions that mainstream efforts to promote racial equality in Brazil, including those related to anti-racial communication, memory, and reparation. The government also recently launched a program directed especially for the youth population, Plano Juventude Negra Viva, aimed at the reduction of vulnerabilities of Black communities and lethal violence based on structural racism. And well, I also would like to mention that this is an important year for Brazil's international agenda as we chair the G20 and get ready for COP30 next year in Belém do Pará. And this also offers a very good opportunity for exchanges and cooperation with our American partners. So to conclude, I'd like to say that in this bicentennial year, Brazil and the US have before them a unique opportunity to really leverage their shared values, their interests, and build an even stronger partnership with tangible long-term results for both societies and a positive impact on our region and beyond. So I also think that the 200 years we are celebrating are a kind of a prologue, because I see much more important achievements ahead of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Shannon, Ambassador Viotti. I'd like to invite you to join us in the audience as we are about to start our next panel. I also want to, recognize and thank for the presence of Anthony Harrington, obviously our co-chair, who is also delivering closing remarks here, Ricardo Zuniga, who was also mentioned before, but also other members of our advisory council who are here. Stanley Gassick, thank you for being here. Gabriel Treba, João Castro Neves, all important figures for the Brazil Institute in this 200 years of bilateral relations. And also thank everyone who's watching us online. I'm sure we have a good number of people doing that. So to introduce the moderator of our stellar panel, our next panel, I'd like to invite onto the stage Tona Boyd. Tona is the Associate Director Counsel to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and she previously served in the White House as a special counsel and special assistant to the president, where she worked to advance President Biden's agenda related to social justice, equity, and judicial nomination. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bruna, for that warm introduction. And thank you also to the Wilson Center, Brazil Institute, and Race Inequality for hosting this really important conversation. So as Bruna said, my name is Tona Boyd, and I am the Associate Director Counsel at the Legal Defense Fund. And we are the nation's premier legal organization that is fighting for racial justice. We use the power of law, narrative, research, and people to defend and advance the full dignity and citizenship of Black people in the United States. Our work is focused on 4 primary pillar areas that include economic justice, education equity, political participation, and criminal justice. And our mission is really to build and advance a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy where dignity is sacred, where power is shared, and where thriving is the standard. We know in the United States that people of color, which includes Black, Latinx, and Indigenous, as well as Asian American people, will comprise the majority as soon as 2043. In light of this demographic shift, the mandate to fully realize the promise of equality that is enshrined in our Constitution couldn't be more imperative. But we know that the United States has not yet lived up to the promise of equality. The Black-white homeownership rate gap is wider now than it was in 1968, when the U.S. Congress passed seminal legislation banning housing discrimination. While wealth increased during the COVID-19 pandemic, the racial wealth gap has persisted. In 2022, for every $100 in wealth held by white households, Black households just hold $15. Black people continue to work in low-paying jobs and industries compared with white people with the same level of education. They continue to face discrimination in access to credit and other financial services that limit the ability to start a company and compete with other businesses. Higher educational institutions, particularly selective public and private colleges and universities that often serve as a gateway to leadership positions, continue to admit students of color at far lower rates compared to their proportion of the college-age population. Black people in the United States are killed by police at more than twice the rate of white Americans. While Blacks make up 13% of the overall population, Blacks make up 37% of the prison population and are almost 4 times as likely to be arrested for marijuana possession, for example, than a white person, despite similar rates of usage across races. Brazil's history, unfortunately, tells a similar story. While more than 55% of Brazilians identify as Black, data indicates that there are still deep inequalities when it comes to access to basic services, opportunities in the job market, disproportionate impacts in homicide rates, and state violence inflicted on communities. In both the United States and Brazil, these inequalities trace back to the legacy of slavery, decades of government-sanctioned discrimination, and insufficient enforcement of civil rights laws. The Legal Defense Fund was honored to be a part of the Joint Action Plan to Eliminate Racial and Ethnic Discrimination delegation to Brazil in March of this year, where we joined members of Congress and civil society for a robust exploration of the work being done in the United States and Brazil to address our shared history of racial subjugation and inequality. it was incredibly valuable to have the opportunity to visit a Quilombola community to learn of their history and culture of resistance. We met with a number of ministries, including the Ministry of Racial Equality and Minister Aniel Franco, on the very day that key arrests were made in the horrific murder of her sister, human rights and racial activist Marielle Franco. We were able to spend time in dialogue and conversation with members of civil society groups working to combat racism and racial discrimination in education, in health, and in the justice system. The entire delegation was deeply affected and impacted by the afternoon we spent in a terreiro, learning about the blight of religious racism on Black and Indigenous communities in Brazil. This trip marked such an important re-engagement on JAPER and was a reinvigoration of what we hope will be an ongoing dialogue about the important work and lessons that the United States and Brazil can share in our joint efforts to eliminate racism and racial discrimination. I now want to introduce our esteemed panelists and have a conversation about the important work we're doing to address some of these challenges ahead. So first, I'd like to welcome to the stage Desiree Cormier-Smith. Desiree is the Special Representative for Racial Equality and Justice. She previously worked at the Open Society Foundation as the Senior Policy Advisor for Africa, Europe, and Eurasia. In that role, Ms. Cormier-Smith led the Foundation's U.S. advocacy strategy on a wide range of human rights issues. From 2015 until 2020, she was the Senior Director with the Albright Stonebridge Group's Africa practice, where she advised and assisted private and social sector clients on growth strategies across the African continent. Ms. Cormier-Smith began her State Department career as a Foreign Service Officer with assignments in Mexico, South Africa, and Washington, D.C. She currently serves on the Advisory Council for Global Kids, which is an educational nonprofit aimed to inspire underserved youth to pursue careers in public policy and global affairs. She also serves on the advisory board of Shea Yaleen, a social enterprise dedicated to empowering women in West Africa. Ms. Cormier-Smith is also a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. I'd now like to welcome to the stage Inai Lopez dos Santos. Inai is a professor of history of the Americas at the Federal Fluminense University. She holds a BA, MA, and PhD in history from the University of Sao Paulo. Her research area focuses on the history of slavery in the Americas, the study of ethnic racial relations in the American continent, as well as the teaching of African history and racial studies in Brazil. She is also a columnist for DW Brazil, a consultant for the podcast Projeto Quirino, a curator of the permanent exhibition at Cais do Valongo, and curator of the exhibition Pequeñas Áfricas, O Rio que o Sambo Crio. She has written multiple books, such as Beyond the Senzala, Slave Housing Arrangements in Rio de Janeiro, 1808 to 1850, and The History of Africa and Afro-descendent Brazil. So please join me in welcoming our panelists, and I will now join them for a conversation. So as we know, there has been a profound connection between the history of people of African descent in the United States and in Brazil, which in part informs the relationship between the two countries today. I want to turn to Inai first and ask, your work has focused on the history and impact of slavery in the Americas. Given the profound impact of the transatlantic slave trade Brazil and the U.S. had, what lessons can our shared histories teach us about how to address the lasting harms and stain of slavery?
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for the question. I'd like to thank for the Wilson Center and Brazil Institute to invite me. It's an honor to be here with you. It's a pleasure. So I think that we have a huge problem to deal with the memory of the slavery in America. And I think that the first problem is that we actually have a very difficult to understand the slave person, the slave people as a person. You know, in our studies, in academic studies, we have a lot of important works that show how these people, the African and their descendants in America, build the continent, Brazil and US and Mexico, Cuba, and other countries. But when we go to the basic school, we can see that, you know, in Brazil, and I think that the same thing happened here in US. Black kids, when they learn about their country history, they just can see them and their family as property, not as a person that even in a slave system, work and construct this country. So I think that it's very important to review the way that we teach our history. And I think that it's a huge thing that we should done, but I think that's in education and as a historian teacher, of course, I think that's something very important to do. In Brazil, actually, we started this with a very important law. 10.639 is the number of the law that obligate that all the schools and universities teach about African culture, African history, and Black Brazilian history also. But we have a lot of problems to implement this law in Brazil. Actually, this law just function when the teachers want, you know. So we still have an education system that just see Brazil actually just made. Oh, let me reformulate this part. In our system, in our education system, we still have white history, and 2, 3, 4 times a year, the students start to learn about Black people, African people in Brazil, or indigenous people also, population in their countries. And, you know, it's a kind of ghetto in our education system. So I think that the same thing happens here in United States and other countries, because I have the chance to see the materials, the educational materials about these countries. So I think that is very important to deal with this problem, because we are deal with the future. We still educate our children to think just about their country as a white country. And in Brazil, it's even worse, because the majority of population is Black. So we should change this. You know, I think that is a huge challenge, and I think that this connection between this bilateral relationship between Brazil and in America could be very important to change that, to try to develop different kind of materials to teach at school, and also for the what we call public history, you know, because we have a. So I'm finished here, because we have in Brazil and all around the world, we are seeing the I forgot the word in English, extrema direita. Yes, thank you very much. Is increased a lot, and now in Brazil we have to say yes, we had slavery in our past. It's something completely crazy to think that now I have to say and to prove that Brazil had a slavery past. So we have to to change the way that we see our history and how we teach.
Absolutely. Thank you for those comments. And, that just brings to mind, again, how much there is such a synergy between what's happening in Brazil and what's happening in the United States. What you just mentioned in terms of having to actually fight to educate people about the existence of slavery and racial discrimination is just an incredible part of this sort of extremist backlash that we're seeing right now. So in the United States, for example, we're seeing that very much happen in our classrooms and in state houses across the country, where laws are being passed, where folks are trying to deny the true history of racism and exclusion and discrimination in the United States. And there's so much that we have to do to fight back against that, especially in these moments where the realities of the impact of racial discrimination are still very real for Black communities. And so I think it's really important that you raise that, and it's part of what can be so important about the ongoing dialogue, not just at the academic level or the governmental level, but also at the civil society level. And that's something we really benefited from on our trip to Brazil this spring, was being able to share some of the strategies that we're using, for example, at the Legal Defense Fund, to combat this effort to have not a true representation of our history and culture in our classrooms. So at the Legal Defense Fund, for example, we are founding a project that's called the Pro-Truth Project. And we have sued, for example, in Florida to enjoin and stop pernicious bills that try to eliminate the true teaching of accurate history in the United States. And that's something that we're able to share with our civil society partners in Brazil, and we hope to continue that exchange. In the same way, I also want to call out the many ways in which the United States can really learn from what's happened in Brazil. This is especially true with affirmative action, which is a very relevant topic right now, given the recent Supreme Court decision here that really struck a blow at affirmative action policies in higher education in the United States. But Brazil has such a brilliant example of the way that you can use affirmative action in a way to further equity, equality, and inclusion. So those are just a couple of examples of the ways in which I think there are really important exchanges that can take place. And I want to turn now to Desiree to talk a little bit about how this plays out in our foreign relations community. So you, as the Special Representative for Racial Equity and Justice, I want to ask, how have the U.S. and Brazil demonstrated their commitment to combating racial discrimination, particularly through their support for forums such as the United Nations Permanent Forum on People of African Descent and the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues?
Yeah, well, thank you, and thank you again to the Wilson Center and to Race and Equality for putting on this important discussion and for inviting me to participate. Let me take a step back and just clarify my mandate, because it is a brand new mandate for the State Department. So I'm the first ever Special Representative for Racial Equity and Justice. It's a position that was just created in 2022, and my mandate is twofold. One is to ensure that U.S. foreign policy programs, assistance, promote and protect the human rights of members of marginalized racial, ethnic, and indigenous communities, including people of African descent, and to build global partnerships to combat structural racism, discrimination, and xenophobia around the world. To be clear, my mandate was not created, my position was not created because we think we have already solved these challenges in the United States. I approach this work with great humility, and I approach it in the spirit of partnership. And Brazil is one of our premier partners in doing this work because of our shared challenges and our shared history. I think as the country with the largest population of Black people outside of the continent of Africa, Brazil has the responsibility to be a global leader on combating anti-Black racism. As the largest democracy in this hemisphere, Brazil has an obligation, a responsibility to be a global leader. And as the country with the second largest Black population outside the continent of Africa and the region's second largest democracy, I think the United States also has a responsibility. And so it just makes sense for us to partner on these efforts because you cannot talk about democracy without talking about a multiracial, multiethnic democracy. And so many times, too many times, we talk about democracy, but we leave that part out of it. And I think our two countries really show the importance of emphasizing that true democracy can only be it has to be multiracial. It has to be multi-ethnic. Racism is incompatible with democracies. And I think it was quite eye-opening in both of our countries when we saw the backlash to the results of our most recent elections. And part of that backlash was because the presidents were elected by multiracial, multi-ethnic coalitions, right? So we saw, and it's not unique to the United States and Brazil, we also saw it in Guatemala, we've seen it in other places, where there is a reaction to results when people of African descent, when indigenous peoples actually exercise our rights to vote. Then it's called into question the legitimacy of those results, right? So it has been really fantastic to be able to partner with my counterparts in Brazil, including Minister for Racial Equality, Aniele Franco, and Minister for Indigenous Peoples, Sonia Guajajara, on trying to elevate our partnership on these issues through JPER, and also through multilateral and regional bodies like the UN Permanent Forums, both the newly created one for people of African descent and the longer established one on indigenous issues. This is, it's not as easy as it should be, frankly, because, while I consider both of these really fantastic women the closest things I have to counterparts, there is an important distinction in our portfolios. I am at the State Department, so my mandate is on foreign policy. Their mandates are really focused on Brazil internally. And so what I like to think of, part of my role is being a bridge between the foreign and the domestic policy. And this is critically important on issues like racial inequality, where it cannot be a one-way street. We are not perfect. We don't have all the answers. We cannot, nor do we, try to lecture Brazil or any other country on how to address systemic racism. We don't have the credibility to do that. We do, however, I think, have good practices. We have a really fantastic and robust civil society. And we have, I think, some important lessons learned and some mistakes learned that we can share with our partners. But just as important is for us to learn from other partners, especially a country like Brazil. So, I think I was really thrilled that we reinvigorated JPER, but one of the first things that Minister Franco and I agreed on was that we can't just reinvigorate or resuscitate the 2008 version of JPER. It has to be fit for purpose. It has to be designed to meaningfully address the challenges of 2024, right? And it also has to ensure robust and meaningful civil society participation in order for it to have real impact. And that's hard. That's really hard because, one of the most important, I think one of the most valuable things about JPER is the civil society track, but also it has to include the bilateral government component so that we are sharing good practices and lessons learned with each other. So we are in the process of defining those work streams. Nothing in any government goes as quickly as anyone would like. It is even slower when you're dealing with two massive governments and two massive bureaucracies. But I think JPER is really a model that other countries have pointed to and said, we would like to pursue our own version of JPER. And one of the things I'm very proud of is as a result of our highlighting of JPER, I was actually able to convince the Canadians to begin discussions with the Brazilian government about pursuing their own JPER. And so I think it is a really powerful program, but the real value will be seen in the impact, which I think is yet to be seen for this revitalized version of JPER.
Thank you so much for that. I think we might have time for one more question from the panel, and then we may have a few minutes to open up for questions from the audience. So my last question that I want to put to both of you is about how we define our hope for the future, not just in the relationship between the United States and Brazil and sort of this prologue that was spoken about by our ambassador speakers, but how do we define the hope for the work that we hope to do mutually within our two countries?
It's a great question. I think that we should face the problem of the problem of racism in both countries because they are different. And they have different histories in Brazil and U.S. And it's interesting to hear Desiree because I teach history in a public university, and now I have, I think that 50% of my students are black, and this didn't happen in my faculty time, so 20 years ago. So the affirmation actions is something very important in our present, and we still have a kind of myth that just in U.S. we have racism, because in Brazil we still have the problem of the racial democracy myth. So Brazil is, a miscegenation country with, everybody has a black friend or a black girlfriend or a light. There's different kinds of excuse. And what I'm seeing now is that with this black young at university, with not this part of black youngs, but this is this part that I deal every day. They are changing they are demanding another things, another authors to discuss in our class, another issues to research. So I think when we talk with black people, with indigenous people, when we heard and when we learn with social movements, then I can see hope. Because I think that you also have to change, especially in academia and at universities, the image that just us can have the power of the knowledge, and this is not true. Of course, that what we've done at university is very important, but all the gains that we have in Brazil and United States is because of the not only the black movement, but the social movements and how they create different kinds of educational system also. So I think that we have to stop everything and actually learn with the social movements, and because these social movements are deal with these challenges that we are discussing for so many years, and they develop different kind of strategies that can help us. So I think that dialogues the most hopeful thing that we can done, and I think that we have different, of course. We have to deal with the different natures of each movement, but I think that this is a very important strategy to, and I think that both Brazil and U.S. governments start to do that. They are doing this right now, but I think that we have to do this more and to input the university together and discuss and actually learn with the social movements.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Desiree?
I mean, I think I agree. What gives me hope is our young people, right? Their consciousness, as well as the moment that we're in right now. And I know that can sound ironic because we have seen a lot of pushback, but you only see pushback after great moments of progress, right?
Yeah.
And so I am actually quite hopeful. Because out of darkness, there's light. And that doesn't happen naturally, but I think because of young people, because there are enough committed people in this world, in this fight for equality, right? It's just about basic human dignity and equality. That's it. But I think there's enough of us in academia, in civil society, in governments, that now see that this is no longer optional, right? This work cannot be an afterthought. If we are to meet any of our and I'll say foreign policy because I'm at the State Department, but my firm belief is that if we are to meet any of our foreign policy goals, we cannot do them without applying a racial equity lens. We cannot. We cannot secure democracies. We cannot foster democracies where racism is present, when entire segments of the population don't have access to their right to vote or don't have appropriate representation. We cannot promote sustainable economic development when entire segments of your population don't have access to quality education and therefore are unable to access formal job opportunities. We can't have peace and security when entire segments of your population are locked out of the formal economy and are desperate to find ways, whether that be through illicit means, to support their families, right? So I am fully convinced that we have now opened the box, and it's too late to go back and say, no, we can't go any further. And what gives me hope is the fact that after the horrific murder of George Floyd, not only did we see the largest, most diverse peaceful protests here in the United States, we saw them all around the world. Yes. And that was not just out of solidarity with Black Americans. Mm-hmm. That was because something resonated with people, from Sri Lanka to France to Nigeria to South Africa to Brazil, everywhere in the world. We also saw, after the horrific murder of George Floyd, a new push, a new momentum to actually acknowledge the reality and the existence of anti-Black racism. There had been decades of advocacy at the UN and at the Human Rights Council to finally create a standing permanent forum dedicated to people of African descent. It was only the murder of George Floyd that provided that last push to get states to actually do something, right? We saw the Human Rights Council, led by the Africa Group, create a global independent mechanism to look at the realities of racism in law enforcement globally. And some of their first trips were to the United States and Brazil. But that wouldn't have happened without the horrific murder of George Floyd. Mm-hmm. So this is what gives me hope, is that there is now this global recognition of the persistence and reality and the systemic nature of anti-Black racism. There is now a global recognition of anti-Indigenous racism. There's now a global recognition of anti-Roma racism and how they're all interconnected. And so now that we have this information, it is incumbent upon us to do something with it. And I don't think, because I've met enough committed people around the world in various sectors of society, I don't think that we are just going to ignore this information. So that's what gives me hope.
Thank you so much for that. I will just close the formal conversation by saying, last week marked the 70th anniversary of the landmark decision Brown versus Board of Education here in the United States. And that was a Supreme Court decision that, in essence, ended state-sanctioned apartheid in the United States. So it struck down the separate but equal doctrine that enabled state-sponsored segregation to be in all aspects of U.S. life, from public schools to train cars to places of public accommodation. And that decision from 1954 was really a watershed moment in the United States, and really was the way in which our modern multiracial and multi-ethnic democracy was founded. Because before Brown, we didn't have that full ability to live in a society without segregation. And so looking back at that important anniversary and marking that commemorating that case over the course of this year, I think has given me tremendous hope and inspiration. Because when I think about what our ancestors faced in that moment, where every single sign had a division for Black versus white, and yet there was a group of parents and children and lawyers and civil rights activists who saw that and who decided to challenge it and to ultimately become victorious in taking it down. I know, based on that past experience, that we can do that now. We can address the challenges that we've talked about today that are facing us, not just in the United States, but really around the world when it comes to anti-Black racism and discrimination facing all different kinds of communities. So that gives me profound hope to think about that legacy and that history. And I think the important relationship that we have between the United States and Brazil is a very important vehicle through which we can continue to pursue change. And so that gives me hope. I want to now open it up to see if we have any questions from the audience. Yes, this gentleman.
Thank you very much for this wonderful panel. I would like to hear the panelists' thoughts on what these efforts that you're describing can do now to help provide some guardrails for the Brazil-U.S. relationship going forward. Because the way I'm listening to this sort of comparative project, I keep on constantly going back in my historian's mind thinking about what was going on in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s. There's a sort of very similar kind of moment when especially the United States was looking at Brazil for some lessons. And there were all sorts of, this is one of the reasons why Gilberto Frei was being read in the US, but Frank Tannenbaum was writing about race in a sort of hemispheric fashion. And obviously, this was amidst a lot of different phenomena, whether it was alliance during World War II, it was a José Carioca and Disney, a whole host of things going on. But it all breaks down when Brazil becomes a military dictatorship and the U.S. passes the Civil Rights Act. One country's resolved, the other becomes irredeemable, and the conversation only really starts in a certain way much, much later after. So I'm just wondering, there are going to be political changes in both countries. What are the kinds of things that can be done right now so that the conversation doesn't stop, when some of those changes come about in the future?
Would you want to start?
Could
Sure, I could start.
Okay.
I think this is one of the reasons why the civil society participation in JPER is so critical, because that is meant to outlast and endure any government changes on either side. And we've seen, even when JPER went dormant, because of a lack of political will in the United States and in Brazil, there were still civil society connections that continued, right? Maybe not formally through JPER, but they were forged out of JPER and they were able to continue. And so that is the hope, that is the goal, and that is the reason why it's so important to have robust and meaningful civil society participation in JPER, and also to help inform the government dialogues, right? Because we don't want to stay in our echo chambers. We recognize and acknowledge that civil society is often closer to the problem, so they often have the solutions, right? And so it's important for them to have the space to also somehow inform the government track of JPER. And so that really, for me, is how we're trying to safeguard the relationship, is really through JPER and the civil society participation in it.
I totally agree with Desiree, but I think that there's a difference in nowadays because we have the social medias, and I think that social medias is a very important, not every time good, but is a very important instrument to establish a dialogue, especially among Black people, Black youngest people that know more about their history, the Blackness history, in these social medias than at school or university. So I think that this is a very important instrument that we have to pay attention what happened in the social medias also.
I agree. I'll just add, I completely agree with what both of the panelists said, and I will say that was the power of being a part of the delegation as a member of civil society this past spring. I think the idea was for us to build and make connections and reify some of the relationships that existed previously so that we have that more durable fabric of the civil society connections, irrespective of what's happening with respect to official connection and sort of relationships. So that was very powerful for us, and I know that's something that the Legal Defense Fund will continue to engage in, even as we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works in the U.S. Okay. Do we have time for one more question? Okay, one more question we have time for.
Oh my God.
Is there? Okay.
3, 4.
Okay. I see this gentleman here, and there's somebody in the back as well.
Yes, excellent panel. My name is Stan Gassick. I'm a member of the advisory board to the Brazil Institute of the Wilson Center. Also senior advisor for global strategies, the United States Commercial Workers, and proud member of the board of directors of the Washington Brazil office. My colleague Musa from the Washington, Brazil office is here with me today. My question is this about JAPER, and particularly with the work of the Defense Fund, Legal Defense Fund. Are you seeing through the JAPER process now, even though legal recourse is not the only avenue, to try to fight racism and discrimination in both countries, but are you seeing through the JAPER process now that there's really an effective exchange of best practices with regard to looking at the strengths and weaknesses of both legal systems? In Brazil and the United States, administrative law access, which has been more of a challenge in Brazil, as well as the question of judicial access. And I would actually say, I'm sure as you know very well, is that it would appear with the STF's decision not too long ago sustaining the constitutionality of affirmative action in the university system, that maybe Brazil is a little bit more advanced in terms of judicial doctrine right now. But I think for me, I'm also a lawyer, but I think this is really, legal recourse is not the only avenue, but it is critical.
That's right.
In the combating of racism and discrimination. So I'd be interested in your reflections on how far you think JAPER is going with that. Thank you.
Sure, that's a great question, and I think that was very powerfully true of our conversations. Certainly at the Legal Defense Fund, we use every tool in the toolbox to advance racial equity and racial justice in the United States. So while litigation through our court system is one avenue, we also need to have community organizing. We need to have policy advocacy. We need to be narrative shifting and changing. We need to be educating the population, and I think the same is true in Brazil. And we certainly had an opportunity through the JAPER exchange, where we had very robust conversations with community members, with other members of civil society, that there was a lot to learn about the various tools that you can use based on the legal landscape in a particular country, which, as you noted, when it comes to affirmative action, is very different in Brazil versus the United States right now. But there are other areas in which I think we were able to also lend some expertise in terms of how we're combating public safety and reimagining public safety and police accountability. So there were a number of sort of lanes of conversation that I think were really helpful and important, and part of why I know we want to continue to invest in these conversations and dialogues long term. Okay, I think that was the last question that we had time for, so I want to thank our esteemed panelists for joining us, and I now would like to introduce our final speaker, Ambassador Anthony Harrington. Mr. Harrington is the former U.S. Ambassador to Brazil and is currently serving as the founding principal of the Albright Stonebridge Group and is co-chair of the Wilson Center Brazil Institute Advisory Council. Mr. Ambassador, will you please join us? Thank you.
Did you stay here?
No. Okay.
See. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone here in the auditorium and many people online, as Bruna noted. It's a distinct pleasure to serve with Tom Shannon as co-chair of the Brazil Institute, continuing our forever love of a second country, and pleasure to have welcomed and work with Ambassador Viacci, and to have Bruna Santos keep us in line here at the Wilson Center, Brazil Institute. I'm reminded, Tonya, after those informative and inspiring remarks, you and the panel, that years ago I represented the NAACP and ACLU suing Prince George's County for a pattern of police brutality successfully. I have a wonderful county executive there now who is black and is hopefully going to become a member of the U.S. Senate after the election. I also, as outside general counsel for the Democratic National Committee years ago, sued the Republican National Committee and the New Jersey State Republican Committee for a pattern of intimidation of voters in black areas. And the RNC and the state committee wisely entered into a consent decree quickly, which lasted for years. The judge kept it alive, but is no longer in force at this point. So before making a few additional remarks, I'd like, assuming IT is working, to introduce Ambassador Bagley, Elizabeth Frawley Bagley, a video which she has provided. She was here for the high-level dialogue and at the embassy residence hosted by Ambassador Viacci on Monday evening, but needed to head back to Brazil, so wouldn't be here in person, but was happy to provide us video. So let me turn over to Ambassador Bagley.
Boa noite. Thank you to the Wilson Center Brazil Institute for hosting this important conference and all your work to support a robust relationship between the United States and Brazil. The U.S. mission in Brazil is busy commemorating the bicentennial anniversary of U.S.-Brazil diplomatic relations, and I want to congratulate you on amplifying one of the most consequential relationships in the world. First, I want to express my heartbreak at the impact of the devastating floods in Rio Grande do Sul. As President Biden said, the United States stands with Brazil at this difficult time, and I commend the government of Brazil for responding quickly to this humanitarian disaster. More personally, I'm heartened by the response from Brazilians across the country, raising money for those who lost their homes and all their belongings, donating food, water, hygiene items, clothes, and much more, and even finding innovative ways to deliver the items to those in need. Many members of my team throughout the U.S. mission have joined this effort in their personal capacities by raising money and making personal donations to those most affected. I'm pleased that the United States contributed close to $1 million, or 5 million reais, for water purification and 50,000 for hygiene, first aid, and cleaning kits, not to mention what U.S. companies and charities are doing. Combating the global climate change crisis is evidenced by the floods in Rio Grande do Sul, and the drought in the Amazon is of critical importance to all people of the world. I applaud President Lula's leadership in reducing the rate of deforestation in the Amazon region. We will continue to work with Brazil to increase law enforcement cooperation in the region, such as through our recent donation of night vision goggles to the Brazilian Institute of Environment and Renewable Natural Resources, also called IBAMA. I'm proud the United States is the top source of foreign direct investment in Brazil, and we want to ensure that Brazil has a key role as we establish resilient supply chains, whether for car batteries, critical minerals, or fertilizers. Part of growing our economies involves strengthening workers' rights, and I am pleased our presidents joined together last September to launch the Global Partnership for Workers' Rights. This initiative empowers workers and has the potential to change lives and strengthen our economies. Our presidents have also demonstrated time and again their commitment to helping marginalized people. We aim to combat discrimination against Black and Indigenous peoples, and we relaunched last year the Joint Action Plan to eliminate racial and ethnic discrimination and promote equality, also known as JAPER. These are just a few examples of all that we are doing to strengthen our relationship for the future. Thank you again for inviting me to speak to you tonight. Muito obrigada.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. If you watched the reproduced video of this occasion for your distinguished diplomatic service, including serving as ambassador to Portugal so that you could speak Portuguese in Brazil. As had been noted, President Lula and President Biden had a very good visit, their initial visit when he came here. Among other things, he was appreciative of the fact that President Biden had almost immediately acknowledged President Lula's election. It's kind of cutting off the phenomenon that we've seen in Brazil and here. As a reflection of alignment in policies and priorities, President Lula observed that he had read President Biden's State of the Union address to the Congress and said that he could give the same address in Brazil and might do it. And they focused very much on democracy, social equity we're talking about today, and the environment. The U.S. high-level dialogue that was just concluded, a good example and forum for maintaining and elevating the bilateral relationship, and had the privilege of meeting Ambassador Rocha, I think Deputy Secretary at the Foreign Ministry, and we previously had a panel here with Minister Haddad and other senior Brazilian officials focused on taking advantage of the G20 leadership position that Brazil has now. As noted, we're talking about the two largest countries in the hemisphere. We're also talking about two of the largest democracies in the world with shared history of slavery, as discussed, and racial inequity. But the comments today are encouraging about the continuation of addressing those concerns. Otherwise, we might sue somebody again. Happily, I've always observed that seems to be a natural affinity between Brazilians and Americans, which helps with the understanding and relationships. I was pleased to unexpectedly find myself as ambassador in Brazil under Presidents Cardoso and Clinton. And they were each other's closest first family friends, the Clintons and the Cardosos, which elevated my relationships and ability to make an impact. We accomplished a lot of things together during that time. I won't take time to detail, but we also have parallel challenges. The continuation of achieving racial equity that was the focus of today's discussion, but also polarization in both our countries, a shrinking middle and a growing of extremes in the political arena. And it's not just in Brazil and the U.S., it's too much of a phenomenon around the world. We also have shared challenges, economic challenges and fiscal concerns, which Minister Haddad and team are trying to address there, and hopefully we will make some better efforts here on fiscal management. Brazil really does have a key role to play in the defense of democracy, along, hand in hand with us. An example is effort to restore free and fair elections in the country of Venezuela, upcoming, hopefully, with Brazil's and U.S.'s impact. President Macron was in Brazil recently visiting President Lula, and they both made some very helpful statements. I think in ongoing relations, as mentioned, the Rio Grande do Sul experience indicates that climate change has got to be a top of the list priority for our bilateral and multilateral work together, and democracy and the rule of law still, and maybe more than most times, needs attention and collaboration. And we need to collaborate with Brazil, not just bilaterally, but globally, taking advantage of the G20 Brazil leadership and the upcoming COP30 next year, I think it is. And as noted, civil society organizations are crucial in this whole avenue of concerns. Think tanks, universities, and also the business community, which at my firm we work actively with businesses around the world, and we need CEOs and corporate leaders to put their shoulder to the wheel as well. So let's continue the high-level contacts. We have a strong voice who's recently come to be the director for the hemisphere at the National Security Council, Dan Erickson, who was also there on Monday evening, succeeding the very fine Juan Gonzalez. So let's be optimistic, but not take too many things for granted. So again, thanks for your participation today, in person and online, where many were joining. And let's continue on our bilateral journey onward and upward. Bruna, you.